thumbs up. The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands and millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata, which, I would add, is built in. All we have to do is open to it. It's something that is simple but not so easy to do. And we work at it for lifetimes, really, because we have lifetimes of conditioning, lifetimes of conclusions we've drawn about ourselves, about the world, about others, assumptions, and the conditioning that comes from experiences, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. And all of it combines to be the material with which we create a self-image. We think we are this person, but are we? And this is what our practice is uncovering. It's like going through a treasure hunt. We're finding all kinds of things. I remember being in my grandmother's attic, which was a true treasure trove, actually. She had saved everything from at least the time she was married, and I think before that, because there were these beautiful Victorian dresses that when I was 11 years old, they fit me fine. And she had saved my aunt's flapper dresses. There was a beautiful old brass bed that had probably been their wedding bed 60, 70 years before. And all kinds of things. Among other things, I found, of all things, a Ouija board. Never would have guessed that my grandparents fooled around with a Ouija board. But on the other hand, in the bookcase down in the living room, there was a secretary desk with about 2 shelves worth of books behind glass doors above it. And there were 3 of those books were about Tibet. It was pretty fascinating. We have internal histories like that too. And as we do our practice, they become revealed. Some of them are very enticing and can pull us away from practice. Some of them can be frightening. Some of them can be dull. But pretty much all of them are distracting. And yet our practice really is to gently explore deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. It's almost like swimming through a deep ocean where there's a lot of fish and there's a lot of seaweed, big seaweed, and we're having to kind of wend our way through it in search of that treasure, except that our treasure is down within ourselves. And we're trying not to get caught in the seaweed, not trying to get too entranced by the colorful fish that are swimming around us, and so on and so forth, because there's a deep, profound, transformative treasure within us that is more than important to uncover in this life. The immense freedom that we experience in uncovering that treasure, even a small part of it, comes from momentarily letting go the persona and all the restrictions and all the constrictions and all the framework and all the cage that it provides us. And suddenly we are free to respond to circumstances instead of react to them. It's amazing. It's really the only kind of freedom there is. And it is inborn, and at some level we know that. And so we sit long hours in the zendo. We come to sesshin instead of doing other more interesting, perhaps, things. And and turn our attentions inward and gently, quietly, increasingly quietly search within for some glimmer of that profound truth of who and what we are. We're in day 5 now of this 7-day sesshin here at Hidden Valley Zen Center in Southern California in July 2019 on kind of a hot day, as happens in Southern California in July, which reminds me of a koan in which a monk must be either the midwinter in Japan or China, or the midsummer in one of those countries, because the monk is asking the master almost in desperation, how can we become free of heat and cold? And of course, it gets very, very cold in Japan, and there's no heat. Northern China is the same. And it gets very, very hot and sticky in the summer in Japan, and in certain parts of China as well, not to mention northern Indiana, where I went to high school, where it was smotheringly hot in the summer. How do we escape heat and cold? Well, the master's response was, when it's hot, die to the heat. When it's cold, die to the cold. What does that mean? Shido Bonan, who was Hakuin's grandfather in Zen, whose name, by the way, means the great way is not difficult, famously said, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. And he said, die while alive and be completely dead, then do what you will, all is good. And of course, as you've heard before, that doesn't mean turn into a zombie. It doesn't mean dissociate. It doesn't mean shut down. It means be so alive and so free that there is nothing holding you back. There is no problem. If it's hot, just, oh my God, it's so hot. Oh. When it's cold, it's cold, isn't it? Wishing we were in some other condition is a recipe for suffering. And yet the body is amazingly flexible. When I lived in Canada as a kid, I went to grade school in northern Canada, walking to school in blizzards, 32 below zero. The wind blowing so strong it would knock my little brother off his feet. In the summer, there was a heat wave. It got up to 73 degrees. And my brother and I were sweating. It was so hot, we thought. And then, some years later, we moved back to the United States, where it was 80-some degrees. And then, northern Indiana, when I was in high school. In a house that was very stylish in the 1950s, with all these little narrow windows up above that let in almost no air. There was no airflow, and we did not have air conditioning. I used to pace all night long in the summer. It was too hot to sleep. And if I went outside to sleep, the mosquitoes would devour me. And of course, then there was Japan. At So-Genji, one time, in 1 week, there were 3 different incidents in which there were fires at the temple. And fire is very, very serious in Japan. It has taken whole cities. It has taken countless lives. And in fact, in the Kobe earthquake, what took more lives than the actual earthquake itself was the fires that raced through all these traditional wooden buildings. and killed people who were caught in the debris. They might have been rescued otherwise. And so, in response, the Roshi said, okay, you've got to turn in all the mosquito coils, because the last fire had been caused by someone who had tossed off his blanket in the middle of the night, and it had landed on an unprotected mosquito coil that was burning, and it smoldered and actually charred one of the pillars in the zendo. Before that, I had thought the mosquito coils were more or less useless because there would always be 8 or 10 bites in a given hour of sitting. Well, once the mosquito coils were taken away and there was no mosquito coil, it was 30, 40, 50 bites in an hour. Thankfully, he relented after a week, and we got the mosquito coils back. There are stories of monks in Japan going to sit in the bamboo groves, which are rife with mosquitoes, to test the quality of their zazen. Can I remain totally concentrated when I'm being eaten alive by these critters? Something like Shido Unan, who you heard about as going to practice in the cemeteries when the wolves were prowling. We tend to feel like we need a tremendous amount of comfort. We need to have our environment just so in order to be comfortable, in order to function the way we want to function. And yet, going from way sub-zero temperatures in the winter in Canada to living in Mandalay, Burma for several years, where it was 115 to 120 degrees every single day for 8 months. When you sit down in a chair, it's hot to touch. But we got used to it, just like we got used to the icy cold in Canada. Bodies are amazingly flexible. Our minds are meant to be flexible, but so often they're not. And if we've experienced any kind of trauma, then we are deeply invested, and understandably so, in creating a comfort zone, or at least a safety zone around us. To be able to be free, even with a history like that, is amazing. And those of us in this zendo, anyone who has been traumatized is not so traumatized that they cannot access that depth of peace, joy, and freedom, that letting go of self-image that brings that forth. There are some people who are so badly traumatized that there's considerable work that has to be done, and maybe it's not even possible to do it in this lifetime. We see some of that with some of the women veterans that we work with in our Regaining Balance retreats for women veterans with PTSD. Multiple traumas, starting well before they ever entered the military usually. In fact, often they've entered the military to escape a traumatic environment at home. But enough of that. I'd like to share some more of Hakuin's amazing teachings. And today we have a short story. And again, from this book, which is his complete teachings, The Complete Poison Blossoms from a Thicket of Thorn, the Zen Records of Hakuin Zenji. translated by Norman Waddell, who is that premier translator of Hakuin. And here is the story. This is titled, An Old Man from Naniwa. In Naniwa, years ago, there was an old fellow who was marvelously adept at shooting matchlock guns. He had several dozen men as disciples. And one day, as he was walking down the street with 7 or 8 of those students, they happened to encounter an old priest, accompanied by a group of his own students. In passing each other, the disciples bowed their heads in greeting to one another. "Who is that?" asked the old man. "Priest so-and-so of such and such temple," replied one of his followers. "Because of his great wisdom and virtue, people refer to him as a living Buddha." The old man turned his head around and looked hard at the priest. "He may be wise and virtuous, but I'm going to take a musket ball from this bag of mine and take a shot at him. I'll strike him squarely in his vitals. He won't even have time to cry out." The students laughed, thinking their old teacher was just spouting his usual nonsense. He was adept at shooting that type of gun. And somehow in developing that adeptness, he had also developed a keen sensitivity and awareness. And essentially what happened in that story is that he kind of got the number of the famous priest. And here's some commentary by Hakuin about that. No matter how ornate a priest's robes are and how deeply people revere him, such matters are merely outward appearances. They pertain only to the lifetime of the priest. If he were struck by a musket ball, that would be the end of him. But if that priest were also someone who had grasped the marvelous, untransmittable way of the Buddhas and patriarchs, that musket ball wouldn't faze him. It would be powerless in the face of the sound of one hand. Of course, the sound of one hand is Hakuin's favorite koan. Hence, the teaching this old fellow imparted to his disciples about the musket ball is no trifling matter. Now, if he was someone who had not attained the way, his words would, of course, possess a salutary meaning of whatsoever. I ask you, how are you going to avoid this iron musket ball? And what does this iron musket ball represent? We probably don't have much chance of encountering an old man from Japan who's adept at firing musket guns. So what's he really mean? Of course, there is that poem to the koan. How will it be when the light of your eyes is falling? Will you be like the crab with its 7 arms and 8 legs, struggling to get out of the boiling water? If at the time of our death, however it comes, we have freed ourselves from delusion and seen deeply enough into the truth to truly be free, how will it be? I think now of my brother, who died, at this point it was about 4 years ago. My younger brother, who I grew up with, we were 2 years apart. He was a doctor, and he was suddenly diagnosed with a cancerous tumor in his bladder. But he was in excellent shape, having taken very good care of himself, even in the midst of seeing 80 patients a day. And so it seemed like a piece of cake. He would easily survive this. So he was given 2 courses of chemo ahead of the scheduled surgery, in which they spent 10.5 hours removing his bladder and his prostate and creating a new bladder for him out of his intestinal tract. That was the latest way to do these surgeries. That way he wouldn't have anything else in his body that he'd have to take immune suppressant drugs for the rest of his life, because the traditional way to replace bladders is with a pig bladder. And then after the surgery, he had 4 more courses, quite close together, because he was in such excellent physical condition. And 6 weeks after the last chemo, he was dead. It was something of a shock to the rest of us. His wife, who was a nurse, said, well, you know, some cancers are more virulent than others, in which case his was. So I find out that he's only got a few days left to live, which was a shock. And the morning he died, I got a call from one of my sisters who was there, saying he had just breathed his last quite peacefully. He'd been curious about death, and certainly as a physician he saw enough of it. He had one of his office workers got cancer, and he kept her on the books as being on staff and paid her health insurance so she could continue getting treatment through to when she died. And where he lived, in southwestern Virginia, people were always smashing themselves pretty badly, driving fast, being drunk, a few other incidents. And he was quite skilled at putting people's faces back together. There was one man who had gone to a bachelor party and been so drunk he couldn't walk. His buddies carried him to his car and started it for him. He must have been as drunk as he was. And he promptly drove 100 miles an hour into the nearest tree. Of course, he wasn't belted in, and he destroyed his face on the steering wheel. It was the worst case anybody had ever seen in the hospital who actually had survived. And my brother managed to put him back together, put his face back together. He lost an eye, but other than that. So he saw plenty of sobering events, including deaths. He said only 2 things to me. Over all the years, he knew I was practicing Zen. He was somewhat suspicious of it, actually. And when our dad died, he asked if there was, what Buddhism said about what happens to you after you die. And I told him that if he asked himself that question, what happens after you die, long enough, he'd find out. After a year, which surprised me, I didn't think he would have even bothered to think about it more than 5 minutes, but he did. He obviously concerned him for at least a year, because after a year he said, there's nothing. But in the moments after he died, for the next 4 hours, there was a kind of light curiosity and a light grief. Sort of like, I'm in this strange place, what's going on, and I'm not where I'm accustomed to being. And then it transformed into the most phenomenal, indescribable mind state that one can experience. I can only describe it as luminous transparency. Luminous transparency is what the Tibetans describe awakening as. And I have no doubt that my brother was fully conscious, dying. He had specifically refused to take medication, actually. My sister-in-law managed to slip a little bit of morphine into his strip, but not enough for him to sit up and take notice. It lasted for about 18 hours and then it simply faded. What is going to happen to us after we die? How that will be will depend entirely on how we are living and what level of release of conditioning and assumptions and all the ideas of who we think we are. How much of that is let go? And each moment we are sitting zazen, we are moving more in that direction. That we face different kinds of things as we are working in our practice is normal. And it's just the kinds of things that actually would come up for us as we die. So better to work on them now, yes? And let them go, because as Shirobunan did say, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. If you let go who you think you are, let go the reactivity, the assumptions, the conditioning, you won't become a blithering idiot, which is a fear most people have. Rather, you'll be able to tune into a profound sense of the right direction to move in, because it won't be covered up by all the ideas and all the assumptions and all the conditioning. And you'll be able to live life so much more freely. And it'll be so worth it. That assumes, of course, that you continue the practice endlessly, and that part of the practice is what Toreienji, Hakuin's student, called the long maturation, where with each insight, you work to let go, where you've seen that you've been caught. And gradually your behavior is transformed as well. Your thoughts, your words. And this is what Hakuin was referring to, really. That the old priest in the fancy robes might have been famous, but was he really let go? Or was he famous because he wore fancy robes? The more let go we are, the less we feel we need. And whether it's hot or cold, we simply live with it. Of course, if there's something to be done to make it different, we can do that. But if not, we don't get ourselves bent out of shape about it. We don't get irritated and upset. It's just part of the landscape. So when we do die, it won't be a struggle. It will simply be no more breathing. And we'll allow ourselves to move on. Naked, free. Naked and free if we die naturally, whether in a car accident or not. whether simply at night in our own bed, if we have let go enough. So on this 5th day of sesshin, we've done a lot of work already. Let yourself sink deeper. Explore more. With more attention, more subtly. And gradually it'll unfold for you as well. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.